Welcome to Recovery TV. In this segment, I want to talk about 4 ways that recovering sex addicts handle intrusive thoughts. So more on that coming up, so stay with me. Thank you for tuning in to Recovery TV, a channel dedicated to providing you with quality information for your mental health, relational health, and recovery. Today, we're going to talk about 4 ways that recovering sex addicts handle intrusive thoughts. But before we begin, if you like what we're doing on our channel, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and don't forget to ring that bell so that you can be notified when other helpful videos such as this one are posted. As a sex addiction therapist, one of the more common questions I get from my clients is, how do I handle these intrusive thoughts that I'm having? As you can imagine, someone that spends a great deal of time thinking about sex, not thinking about sex, can be a very difficult endeavor in the early stages of recovery. So if you're in recovery or considering recovery for sexually compulsive behavior or sex addiction, I hope that these 4 methods of handling your intrusive thoughts will be helpful to you. So let's begin. One of the first things that I do in working with sex addicts in recovery is to help them eliminate shame from the equation. If you just so happen to be a Game of Thrones fan, then you likely will remember one of the last conversations held between Tyrion and Varys. Without giving too much away, I'll just say that Tyrion and Varys were having a discussion that would not sit well with most people who are in power. And at one point in this conversation, Tyrion looks at Varys and says, "What you're talking about is treason." At which that time Varys responds by saying, "Oh, don't act like you haven't thought about it." And then Tyrion replies with some version of, "Well, of course I've thought about it, but thoughts aren't treason." This is a very important concept to remember in recovery, because one thing that we often can't control are our emotions and our thoughts. So when you think of the concept of intrusive thoughts, what makes them intrusive is that you are not choosing to have them. There are certain thoughts that are unique to every sex addict that we don't want them to have, or we want to minimize those. However, we want to remind them that thoughts aren't treason. In other words, thinking about a behavior and actually doing that behavior are 2 very different things. But a thought is simply a thought. And yes, there are reasons for why that thought is there, and part of therapy is helping you to figure that out. But it is important to recognize the thought for what it is, which is it's a thought. It doesn't signify intent, and it doesn't speak to your character, in other words, who you are. If anything, it says you're human. When you recognize that your thoughts aren't treason, that helps to eliminate shame from the equation. Shame is a very uncomfortable feeling that speaks to the core of who you are, and addicts desperately want to escape that, and they'll use their drug of choice to do that. So the more shameful you feel about your thoughts, the more likely you are to relapse in effort to deal with those thoughts. The second way that recovering sex addicts handle intrusive thoughts is to avoid the pink elephant paradox. If I were to say to you, don't think about pink elephants, you're now thinking about pink elephants. So when I'm working with sex addicts in recovery and we're working on setting boundaries centered around thoughts, one thing I tell them to be careful about is creating a pink elephant situation, which will often exacerbate guilt and shame. One thing I tell my clients is that they can go ahead and expect that they're going to have intrusive thoughts, but intrusive thoughts is not a measuring stick for how well recovery is going. And this leads me right into the 3rd way that sex addicts in recovery handle intrusive thoughts, and that is thought redirection. In other words, I help them to redirect their intrusive thoughts into something else. And so often they get caught up in obsession, and so these intrusive thoughts become thoughts that they get triggered by, and then they will start obsessing about them. And I want them to turn these thoughts into fleeting thoughts. And a good way to understand the difference between an obsessive thought and a fleeting thought is that obsessive thoughts are unintentional and fleeting thoughts are intentional. In other words, if you don't have a plan for these intrusive thoughts, you're likely going to obsess about them because you're not being intentional with it. But when you have a plan for how you're going to handle them, now you can actually create a fleeting thought. So sex addicts aren't going to try to stop every single obsessive thought that comes into their mind, what they're going to do is let it go ahead and come in, and then they're going to send it out on its way. Yes, this is a lot easier said than done, and it helps to work with a therapist who knows what they're doing. But you can start that process now by understanding that fleeting thoughts are going to happen, but you can decide what you're going to continue to think about after the fleeting thought happens. And although this may sound a little strange to some of you, one thing that sex addicts often find helpful is actually talking to themselves out loud. So in other words, when the intrusive thought enters, they will have a dialogue with themselves where they'll say, I'm not going to think about that, I'm going to think about this instead. So if you battle sexually compulsive behavior, or you're a sex addict and you've started recovery, you're working at eliminating shame from the equation. You're avoiding the pink elephant paradox like the plague. Instead of trying to stop those intrusive thoughts from coming in, you're working hard at redirecting them as they come in. And although those 3 tips may have proven to be very helpful to you, I think that what you'll find is that without verbal processing, they'll fall short of the mark. It is extremely important to process these intrusive thoughts with someone that you feel safe with and that you trust with this type of information. And there are 2 types of people that I recommend you have in your life to help you do this. The first type is an immediate contact. This would be someone like your sponsor or a spiritual mentor, someone that is readily available to help you. Because when those intrusive thoughts happen and you do all these other things to help with it, my suggestion is to go ahead and contact this person to tell them that you had these thoughts and you just needed to say it out loud, and that actually helps take the power away from it. The second person I want you to have to help you with this is a planned contact. This would typically be your therapist, because those are contacts that you have planned out from week to week, or once every other week, or sometimes twice a week, but it's scheduled and it's there for you. And it's important that when you have these intrusive thoughts that you're bringing them up to your therapist so your therapist can help you process through them. The more you do that and the more you talk about it and the more you're working your recovery plan, the more likely those intrusive thoughts will dissipate. I hope the information that you found on this video will be helpful for you. And as always, I wish you well on your mental health and your relational health and recovery journeys. See you back here next time.